I never thought I would have to choose between keeping my promise to my late wife and keeping a relationship with my only son. But that's exactly where I am now. My name is Harold, I'm 63, and for the last 8 years, I've lived alone in the house my wife and I built together. It isn't a fancy house. It's an old 2-story place on a quiet piece of land that my wife, Marianne, and I bought when we were still in our 30s. We spent almost 20 years paying it off. Every room has a story. The kitchen still has the cabinet doors Marianne painted herself. There is a crack in the hallway floor from when our son, Ethan, dropped a bowling ball down the stairs when he was 12. The upstairs bedroom was supposed to become Ethan's room when he eventually had children. And the small room at the back of the house was Marianne's favorite. She called it her quiet room. She kept her books there, her sewing machine, old photographs, letters from her parents, everything she considered important. After Marianne passed away, I couldn't bring myself to touch that room. I still haven't. The door remains locked. Not because there's anything valuable inside. Because she made me promise. 3 weeks before she died, when we both knew she didn't have much time left, she took my hand and said something I'll never forget. Harold, when I'm gone, don't let anyone turn this house into something it isn't. I asked her what she meant. She smiled. You'll understand someday. At the time, I thought she was talking about selling the house. She wasn't. Our son Ethan was 36 when his mother died. He took it badly. For the first year, he visited almost every weekend. Then he started coming less. Eventually, he moved to another city for work. We stayed in touch, but not as much as I would have liked. He wasn't a bad son. He was just busy. Then, about 9 months ago, he called me and said he had met someone. Her name was Natalie. He sounded happier than I'd heard him in years. I was genuinely pleased for him. A few months later, he brought her to the house. She was polite, soft-spoken, very careful with her words. But something about her made me uncomfortable. I couldn't explain why. She walked through the house slowly, not like someone seeing a new place, more like someone recognizing an old one. When she entered the hallway, she stopped beside the staircase. She stared at the wall for several seconds. Then she said, "Did you always have this photograph here?" I looked at the photograph. It was an old picture of Marianne and me standing outside the house on the day we moved in. Yes, Natalie smiled. She looked happy. I didn't think much of it. Until she walked into the kitchen. She immediately noticed a small blue ceramic bowl sitting on the counter. It had belonged to Marianne. Natalie picked it up. "She still has this?" I froze. "Who?" Natalie realized what she'd said. She quickly put the bowl down. I thought I'd seen one like this before. I stared at her. "Where?" She shrugged. "Somewhere." I didn't push it. But that night, after Ethan and Natalie left, I couldn't stop thinking about it. She had never met Marianne. At least, that's what Ethan had told me. So how did she know about the bowl? A few weeks later, Ethan called again. This time, he didn't sound nervous. He sounded excited. "Dad, Natalie and I are getting married." I congratulated him. Then he said, "We want to move into your house." I thought I'd misheard him. "What?" "After the wedding. Just for a while." "No." The answer came out before I could soften it. There was silence. Ethan finally said, "You didn't even think about it." "I don't need to. It's a big house." "I know. You barely use half of it." "It's still my home." He sighed. "Dad, I'm your son." "I know." "Then why are you treating me like a stranger?" I didn't have a good answer. Because the truth was, it wasn't Ethan I was worried about. It was Natalie. I told him they could stay for a weekend anytime. But they weren't moving in. Ethan became angry. He said I was being selfish. He reminded me that the house would eventually belong to him anyway. I told him that wasn't the point. Then he said something that really hurt. "Mom wouldn't have wanted you to live alone in that huge house." I went completely silent. Because Marianne had told me exactly the opposite. She had made me promise that no one would move into the house while I was alive. But I had never told Ethan about that promise. I didn't want to use his mother's memory to win an argument. So I simply said, "Your mother had her reasons." Ethan asked what reasons. I told him I wasn't ready to talk about them. He hung up. 2 days later, Natalie called me. I expected her to apologize. Instead, she said, "I think you should let Ethan move in." I asked why she cared so much. She was quiet for several seconds. Then she said, "Because that house belongs to your family." I replied, "That's exactly why I'm careful about who lives there." She sighed. Then, very quietly, she said something that made my blood run cold. "I know what Marianne promised you." I didn't breathe. Nobody knew about that promise. Not Ethan. Not my brother. Not even Marianne's closest friend. I asked, "How do you know what my wife promised me?" Natalie didn't answer. She simply said, "You'll understand when you open the room upstairs." Then she hung up. I sat there for almost an hour. For the first time in 8 years, I took the key to Marianne's quiet room out of the drawer. I stood outside the door. And for reasons I still can't explain, I felt afraid of what I might find on the other side. I stood outside Marianne's room for almost 10 minutes before I put the key into the lock. I had avoided that room for 8 years. Not because I was afraid of what was inside. Because opening that door felt like admitting that she really wasn't coming back. The lock clicked. I pushed the door open. Everything looked exactly as it had the day Marianne left it. Her sewing machine was still beside the window. A stack of books sat on the small wooden table. There was a half-finished scarf hanging from the back of a chair. Even her reading glasses were sitting on top of a notebook. I stood there, unable to move. Then I remembered what Natalie had said. "You'll understand when you open the room upstairs." I started looking around. At first, I didn't see anything unusual. Then I noticed the bookshelf. One of the shelves looked slightly crooked. I pulled it forward. Behind it was a small wooden box. My heart started beating faster. I had never seen it before. The box wasn't locked. Inside were several envelopes, a few photographs, and an old key. The first envelope had my name on it. I opened it. It was from Marianne. The letter was dated 6 months before she died. She wrote about the house. About Ethan. About things she hadn't been able to tell me. But one sentence made me stop. "If Ethan ever brings a woman named Natalie into this house, don't let her stay." I read it again. Then again. I felt cold. Natalie. My wife's letter had mentioned her by name. 6 months before Marianne died. I sat down on the floor. That couldn't be possible. Natalie was only 29. She would have been barely 21 when Marianne wrote that letter. I'd never heard her name before Ethan met her. I continued reading. Marianne said she had met Natalie once. But she didn't explain how. Then she wrote, "She will tell you she knows nothing about me. Don't believe her." I felt sick. There was another envelope. This one was marked, "Harold, only if she comes back." I opened it. Inside was a photograph. It showed Marianne standing outside a small hospital. Beside her was a woman I'd never seen before. And between them was a little girl. I turned the photograph over. There was a date. 23 years ago. And underneath it, Marianne had written, "This is the day I promised to protect her." I stared at the photograph. The little girl looked about 6 years old. I looked closely at her face. There was something familiar about her. But I couldn't place it. Then I noticed the woman standing beside Marianne. She was holding the girl's hand. On the back of the photograph was another name. Rachel. I had never heard Marianne mention Rachel. I searched through the box. There was a second photograph. Then a third. In every photograph, Marianne was with the same little girl. Sometimes they were outside the hospital. Sometimes at a park. Once in front of a school. The girl was always around 6 or 7 years old. I suddenly realized something. The photographs weren't random. They had been taken over several years. The girl grew older. Marianne kept visiting her. But why? I found another letter. This one wasn't addressed to me. It was addressed to someone named Rachel. The letter began, "I know you think I took something from you." I stopped reading. Then I heard a noise downstairs. A door closing. I froze. I was alone. At least, I thought I was. I quickly put the photographs back into the box. Then I heard footsteps coming up the stairs. Slow footsteps. I stepped out of Marianne's room and saw Natalie standing at the end of the hallway. She looked at me. Then she looked at the open door behind me. Her face changed completely. She wasn't surprised. She looked terrified. "What are you doing here?" I asked. She didn't answer. I stepped toward her. "You knew this room existed." She shook her head. "Harold. Who is Rachel?" Natalie looked down. "Where did you hear that name?" I almost laughed. "From my wife's photographs." She closed her eyes. Then she whispered, "I was hoping you'd never find those." My heart stopped. "You know Rachel?" Natalie nodded. I asked the question that had been sitting in my mind since I opened the box. "Who is that little girl?" Natalie looked directly at me and said, "That's me." I couldn't move. Natalie was standing in the hallway, looking at me like she'd been caught doing something she had spent years trying to hide. "You're Rachel." She nodded. "My real name is Rachel Natalie Bennett." I stared at her. "Then why does Ethan know you as Natalie?" She looked away. "Because that's the name I use now." "Why?" She didn't answer. I walked back into Marianne's room and picked up the photograph. You knew my wife? Yes. How? I met her when I was 6. I looked at the photograph again. The little girl was definitely Natalie. Older, but unmistakably her. I felt a strange mixture of anger and confusion. Why did Marianne never tell me about you? Natalie sat down on the edge of the chair. Because she promised she wouldn't. Promised who? My mother. That answer opened another question. Who is your mother? Natalie looked at the photograph. Rachel. I frowned. That's your name. No. My mother's name was Rachel. I stared at her. So why did you use Rachel? She smiled sadly. Because my mother died when I was 7. I didn't know what to say. Natalie explained that her mother had been sick for years. They had lived in a small town several hours away. Marianne had met her at the hospital. Apparently, the two women had become friends. When Rachel's condition became worse, she asked Marianne for a favor. She wanted someone to watch over her daughter if anything happened. Marianne agreed. But she hadn't just watched over Natalie. She had stayed involved in her life for years. School events, birthdays, medical appointments, Christmas gifts, everything. I couldn't understand why Marianne had never told me. Was I supposed to know about you? Natalie shook her head. She didn't want you involved. Why? Because my mother asked her not to tell you. Why would your mother care whether I knew? Natalie looked at me. Because she knew your wife before she met you. That sentence stopped me. What does that mean? Natalie hesitated. Then she said, my mother and Marianne were best friends. I nodded. Okay, but they weren't just friends. I stared at her. What else were they? Natalie looked toward the photographs. They were business partners. I had never heard of Marianne having a business partner. Natalie explained that before Ethan was born, Marianne and Rachel had worked together at a small accounting firm. They discovered that one of their clients was hiding money from employees. They reported it. The company investigated. Eventually, the owner was forced to shut down. But before everything ended, someone threatened both women. Rachel became frightened. She moved away. Marianne stayed. Years later, Rachel became sick. That's when she contacted Marianne again. I looked at the letter addressed to Rachel. What did my wife promise her? Natalie looked down. She promised she'd protect me. From what? She didn't answer immediately. Then she said, my father. I froze. Your father? He wasn't a good man. Natalie explained that her father had disappeared after her mother died. But he hadn't simply walked away. He had tried to take Natalie. Rachel had been afraid of him. She believed he might hurt her daughter. So before she died, she asked Marianne to keep Natalie away from him. Marianne agreed. But there was another problem. Rachel had left Natalie an inheritance. A small trust fund. Her father wanted access to it. Marianne became the person legally responsible for protecting it. That's why she stayed involved. That's why she kept everything secret. I finally understood why the room had been locked. But one question still bothered me. If all of this happened years ago, why are you suddenly back? Natalie looked at me. Because the trust ends when I turn 30. I stared at her. And I'm 29. My stomach tightened. You're here because of the money? She immediately shook her head. No. Then why? She looked at the old photograph. Because my mother left something else. What? A letter. Where is it? She reached into her bag. Then stopped. I can't give it to you. Why? Because it was addressed to Marianne. I frowned. Then why do you have it? Because she gave it back to me. I stared at her. When? 2 weeks before she died. That made no sense. If Marianne knew you were coming back, why didn't she tell me? Natalie looked directly at me. Because she knew you wouldn't believe her. I felt angry. You don't know me. I know more about you than you think. What does that mean? She opened her bag. Inside was a second photograph. This one showed Ethan as a child, standing beside Marianne. And standing beside him was Natalie. I looked at the date. It was 21 years old. Ethan had been 15. I looked at Natalie. You knew my son before you met him. She nodded. Yes. I felt the room spin. How? Natalie swallowed. Because Marianne introduced us. I couldn't speak. Then she said the sentence that changed everything. Your son and I have known each other since we were teenagers. For several seconds, I couldn't process what Natalie had just said. My son knew you? Yes. Since he was 15? She nodded. I looked at the photograph again. Ethan was standing beside Natalie, both of them smiling. Marianne was behind them. The photograph wasn't staged. They looked like they had known each other for years. Because they had. I turned toward Natalie. Why didn't Ethan ever mention you? Because we lost contact. When? When I was 17. Why? She looked down. Your mother told me to leave. I felt confused. Why would she do that? Natalie took a deep breath. Because Ethan had started getting too close to me. I almost laughed. They were teenagers. I know. So, what was the problem? He didn't know who I really was. What does that mean? She looked at me. He thought I was just a family friend. I stared at her. And you weren't. No. She explained that Marianne had been trying to keep her identity private. She didn't want Ethan to know about the trust fund. She didn't want him asking questions about Natalie's father. And most importantly, she didn't want him becoming involved in a situation that wasn't his. But Ethan and Natalie became friends anyway. They went to the same school for 2 years. They studied together. They went to school events. They even had a brief teenage relationship. I couldn't believe it. My son dated you? Very briefly. Does he remember? Natalie looked uncomfortable. He remembers me. I stared at her. Then why did he tell me he met you last year? I don't know. That was the first moment I realized there was another layer to this. Ethan hadn't forgotten Natalie. He had lied. I called him. He didn't answer. I called again. Still nothing. Then I received a text. Dad, please don't talk to Natalie without me. I looked at Natalie. You told him I found the room. She shook her head. No. Then how does he know? She didn't answer. My phone rang again. This time it was Ethan. I answered. Why didn't you tell me you knew Natalie? Silence. Then he said. Because I knew you'd react exactly like this. How long have you known? Since before we started dating. Dating? Yes. How long? Almost a year. I felt betrayed. You deliberately brought her into my house knowing who she was? Dad, it's not what you think. Then explain it. I can't over the phone. Come home. He refused. Instead, he said, ask Natalie why she came back. I looked at her. She was watching me. What does that mean? I don't know. Ethan hung up. I turned toward Natalie. Why did you come back? She looked genuinely upset. I didn't come back for Ethan. Then why? Because of Marianne. I felt my anger soften slightly. Natalie explained that after Marianne died, she stayed away because she thought it was what Marianne wanted. But 6 months ago, she received a letter. It was from a lawyer. Marianne had left instructions that Natalie was supposed to return to the house before her 30th birthday. Not after. Not before. Specifically before. I asked why. Natalie said she didn't know. But the lawyer had given her one sentence. Marianne wanted you to see the house before you make your final decision. What decision? Natalie looked at me. Whether to accept the inheritance. I frowned. Why would the house matter? She shook her head. I don't know. I looked around the room. Then I noticed something. One of the floorboards near Marianne's desk looked newer than the others. I knelt down. What's under there? Natalie went pale. I don't know. I pried the board up. There was a small metal container underneath. It was sealed. Inside was a USB drive and a folded piece of paper. The paper had only one sentence. Harold, if you're reading this, Ethan already knows. I felt my heart sink. I looked at Natalie. Knows what? She shook her head. I don't know. I plugged the USB drive into my laptop. There was only one video file. The date on it was 2 months before Marianne died. I clicked it. My wife's face appeared on the screen. She looked weak. But she was smiling. Then she said something that made me forget how to breathe. Harold, if you're watching this, there's something I need you to know about our son. The video stopped. A password screen appeared. Underneath it was a clue. The name of the woman who saved us. I looked at Natalie. She immediately whispered. Rachel. I entered the name. The file unlocked. But before the video could play, I heard Ethan's car pull into the driveway. He walked into the house, looked at the USB drive in my hand, and said, You're not supposed to watch that. Ethan stood in the doorway staring at the laptop. I'd never seen him look that frightened. Not angry. Not embarrassed. Frightened. I closed the laptop. What aren't I supposed to watch? He didn't answer. I stood up. You've known about this video. He looked at Natalie. Then back at me. I knew Mom recorded something. When? Before she died. Why didn't you tell me? Because she asked me not to. I felt the anger returning. Everyone keeps saying Mom asked them to keep secrets from me. Ethan looked down. She thought you wouldn't handle the truth well. Maybe she should have let me decide that. He didn't respond. I pointed at the laptop. What does Mom say about you? He shook his head. I don't know. You just said you knew about the video. I knew it existed. I never watched it. Why? Because Mom told me I'd regret it if I did. That answer made no sense. I looked at Natalie. Did you know about this? She shook her head. No. Ethan walked into the room and sat down. For the first time, he looked exhausted. I didn't bring Natalie here because of the house. I stared at him. Then why? He took a long breath. Because Mom asked me to. I felt my chest tighten. Before she died? Yes. Why? She told me that someday Natalie would come back. I looked at Natalie. She looked just as confused. What exactly did she tell you? Ethan hesitated. She said if Natalie ever came back, I had to help her. Help her with what? I don't know. That's not an answer. I know. He looked at me. She also told me never to let you open the quiet room unless Natalie was here. I glanced around the room. Why? I don't know. Then why did you bring her? Because she contacted me 6 months ago. Natalie interrupted. Actually, I contacted him because I needed to ask him something. What? She looked at Ethan. He nodded. Then she said, I wanted to know why Marianne had left me money. I frowned. She left you money? Natalie nodded. Not directly. She explained that her mother's old trust had been transferred into an account Marianne controlled. After Marianne died, the account was supposed to be transferred to Natalie. But there was a condition. She had to return to the house before turning 30. I asked, why would my wife make that condition? Natalie shook her head. That's what I've been trying to find out. I looked at Ethan. And you knew? Yes. How? Mom told me. I felt betrayed all over again. You've been keeping this from me for years. I was trying to protect you. Stop saying that. He went silent. Then I opened the laptop again. I entered the password. The video began. Marianne appeared on the screen. She looked directly into the camera. Harold, if you're watching this, then I didn't get the chance to explain everything myself. My throat tightened. She continued. I know you'll be angry with me. She smiled sadly. But I need you to listen before you make any decisions. Then she said something that completely changed the way I understood my own marriage. 23 years ago, before Ethan was born, I made a promise to a woman named Rachel. Natalie leaned closer to the screen. Marianne continued. Rachel believed someone was trying to take her daughter away from her. I looked at Natalie. She was right. Marianne explained that Rachel's husband had been involved in a financial scheme. He had borrowed money from dangerous people. He had used Rachel's name to hide some of the transactions. When Rachel discovered what was happening, she tried to leave with Natalie. But she became seriously ill. Before she died, she asked Marianne to protect Natalie. Marianne agreed. Then came the part one didn't understand. Marianne said, I never told Harold because I was afraid he'd become involved. She paused. And because the person Rachel was afraid of was someone Harold trusted. The video suddenly glitched. Then resumed. Marianne looked more emotional. The person who threatened Rachel was not her husband. I leaned closer. It was someone in our own family. The screen went black. A message appeared. Video 1 of 3. I stared at the laptop. There are 2 more. Ethan nodded. Mom gave me the other drives. I turned toward him. You have them. He reached into his jacket. He pulled out 2 small USB drives. Then he said, There's something else you need to know. What? He looked at Natalie. Rachel wasn't the only person Marianne promised to protect. He put the second drive on the table. She also promised to protect me. I stared at my son. From who? Ethan looked toward the locked door. From my grandfather. I froze. My father. Ethan nodded. No. He whispered. Your father. For several seconds, I couldn't understand what Ethan had just said. Your grandfather? He nodded. My father. I sat down. My father had been dead for more than 20 years. He had never been close to Marianne. In fact, after Ethan was born, I'd almost completely cut contact with him. But I had never imagined he could have been involved in something like this. I looked at Ethan. Why would Mom think your grandfather was dangerous? I don't know. You must know something. I know what she told me. What exactly? Ethan looked toward Natalie. She said Grandpa had been involved in something before I was born. I remembered those years. My father had owned several small businesses. He was always borrowing money. Always making deals. Always promising that the next business would make him rich. Eventually, everything collapsed. I had blamed him for ruining his own life. But I'd never known the full story. Ethan picked up the second USB drive. This is the one Mom told me never to open alone. Why? She said it contains the reason. I took the drive from him. We plugged it into the laptop. A video appeared. This time, Marianne was sitting at the kitchen table. She looked directly at the camera. Harold, there are things about your father that you don't know. I felt a knot forming in my stomach. She explained that before Ethan was born, my father had approached her. He wanted money. A lot of it. Marianne refused. Then he asked her to invest in one of his businesses. Again, she refused. After that, things became strange. Someone began following Marianne. She received anonymous letters. Her car was tampered with. Nothing serious happened, but it frightened her. She eventually discovered that my father was connected to Rachel's husband. They had been moving money through several companies. Rachel had discovered the scheme. That's why she was afraid. Marianne had promised to help her. But there was something else. Something that involved Ethan. Marianne said, Rachel wasn't the only person who discovered what they were doing. The video paused, then resumed. Harold, your father knew that Rachel was pregnant. I looked at Natalie. Her eyes filled with tears. Marianne continued. He believed her child could become evidence against him. That was horrifying. But then she said something I wasn't prepared for. He tried to take Natalie. I looked at Ethan. How? Marianne explained that after Rachel died, my father tried to convince the authorities that he was a relative who could care for Natalie. He failed. Because Rachel had already named Marianne as the person she trusted. That's why Marianne became involved in Natalie's life. That's why she kept her hidden. But then came the biggest revelation. My father had discovered where Natalie was living. He began threatening Marianne. She refused to give Natalie up. Eventually, my father disappeared from our lives. At least, that's what I'd always believed. The video ended. I sat there in silence. Natalie wiped her eyes. Your wife saved me. I nodded. Yes. Then Ethan said, there's more. He picked up the third USB drive. I didn't want to watch it. But I knew I had to. He inserted it. The screen showed Marianne again. This time, she looked directly at me. Harold, if you're watching this final recording, I need you to know something about Ethan. My son looked away. Marianne continued. Ethan doesn't know the entire truth. I looked at him. He seemed shocked. What does she mean? I pressed play. Marianne said that when Ethan was 15, she discovered that my father had contacted him. He had sent Ethan letters. He told him stories about our family. He convinced Ethan that Marianne had hidden something from him. Ethan had believed him. That's why Ethan suddenly became distant from his mother during his teenage years. I remembered that period. I had always thought it was just teenage rebellion. It wasn't. My father had been manipulating him. Marianne eventually found out. She confronted my father. And shortly afterward, he disappeared. But the final recording wasn't about that. Marianne looked into the camera and said, I need Harold to understand one thing. She paused. The house isn't really ours. I stared at the screen. What? Marianne continued. Years ago, Rachel helped me buy the land. I looked at Natalie. The house wasn't just a family home. It had originally been purchased using money connected to Rachel's trust. I couldn't believe it. Then Marianne said, one day, Natalie will come back. She looked directly into the camera. And when she does, Harold, you must give her the choice of what happens to this house. The video ended. Nobody spoke. I looked at Natalie. She looked overwhelmed. Then she said, that's why I came. I shook my head. But why now? She reached into her bag. She pulled out an old envelope. Because I received this 6 months ago. She handed it to me. The handwriting was my father's. I recognized it immediately. He had written it shortly before his death. There were only 4 words on the front. To my grandson, Ethan. I stared at the envelope in my hands. My father's handwriting was unmistakable. I hadn't seen it in decades. Ethan looked at me. That's the letter Mom told me about. I looked at him. You've seen this? No. Then how do you know? Because Natalie told me. I turned toward Natalie. Why did you have a letter from my father? She looked uncomfortable. Because he sent it to my mother. I frowned. But it says it's for Ethan. Yes. Then why did your mother have it? Because she never gave it to him. I opened the envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter. It wasn't long. But the first paragraph immediately made me angry. My father admitted that he had been involved in the financial scheme Marianne had discovered. He admitted that he had pressured Rachel. He admitted that he had tried to control what happened to Natalie. But then he wrote something unexpected. He claimed he had done it because he believed Rachel was going to expose him. He was afraid of losing everything. Then he mentioned Ethan. He wrote, I know I failed my son, but I never wanted him to know what I had done. I kept reading. My father said he had watched Ethan from a distance for years. He knew about his education, his first job, his relationships. He even knew about Natalie. Then I reached the sentence that made me stop. When Ethan brings Natalie back into your life, don't stop them. I looked at my son. What does this mean? Ethan shook his head. I don't know. The letter continued. My father said the house had been purchased partly with money that belonged to Rachel. But he claimed that wasn't the reason Natalie had a right to it. The reason was something much more complicated. He wrote that Rachel had once signed an agreement with Marianne. If anything happened to Rachel, Marianne would become the temporary guardian of Natalie. And when Natalie turned 30, the remaining assets would be transferred to her, including the property. I stared at the page. The house belongs to Natalie? Natalie shook her head. I don't know. I continued reading. My father said the legal paperwork had been intentionally hidden. He had destroyed some records. But he hadn't destroyed everything. One original document remained. And it was supposedly inside the house. I looked around. Where? The letter said. Marianne knew where it was. Ask her husband about the blue cabinet. I looked toward the kitchen. The blue cabinet. The same cabinet Marianne had painted herself. I stood up. We walked downstairs. I opened the cabinet doors. Nothing. Then Natalie noticed something. There's a false panel. I looked closely. She was right. Behind the bottom shelf was a thin wooden panel. I pulled it away. Inside was a sealed envelope. My hands were shaking. I opened it. The document was old. It contained the original agreement between Rachel and Marianne. But there was something else. A second page. It stated that the property wasn't intended to become a family inheritance. It was meant to remain available to Natalie until she reached 30. After that, she could decide what to do with it. Sell it, keep it, or transfer ownership. I looked at Natalie. Marianne knew. She nodded. She did. Then why didn't she tell me? Natalie looked at the document. Because she wanted you to make the decision without pressure. I didn't understand. What decision? She pointed to the final paragraph. It said that if Harold continued living in the house, he could remain there for the rest of his life. But no one else could move in without Natalie's permission. I looked at Ethan. Suddenly, everything made sense. The reason Marianne had told me not to let anyone turn the house into something it wasn't. The reason she had specifically mentioned Natalie. The reason she wanted Ethan to help her. And the reason Natalie had returned now. Ethan was asking to move into a house that, legally, Natalie would soon have the right to control. But there was still one thing I couldn't understand. I looked at Natalie. If you knew all this, why did you agree to marry Ethan? She looked at my son. Because I love him. Ethan reached for her hand. But I wasn't convinced. Then why did you hide your identity from me? Natalie looked down. Because I was afraid you would think I was marrying him for the house. I didn't answer. Because that was exactly what I had thought. Then Ethan said something that surprised all of us. I never wanted the house. I looked at him. Then why did you ask to move in? He looked embarrassed. Because Natalie asked me to. I stared at her. She shook her head. No. I asked him to bring me here. Why? She took a deep breath. Because I wanted to see the house before I made a decision. What decision? She looked at me. Whether to give the house back to you. I couldn't speak. She explained that she had no interest in taking my home away. But she had one condition. She wanted the truth about what happened to her mother. She wanted to know why Rachel had trusted Marianne. And why my father had spent so many years trying to hide it. Then she showed us another document. It was from Rachel. It contained a final message. And the first sentence said, Harold's father didn't betray me. Someone else did. I felt my stomach drop. Everything we'd believed about my father might have been wrong. I read Rachel's note 3 times. Harold's father didn't betray me. Someone else did. After everything we'd just discovered, I didn't know what to believe anymore. My father had admitted to being involved. The old documents seemed to prove it. But Rachel's own words suggested there was another person behind everything. I looked at Natalie. Where did you get this? From my mother's belongings. Why didn't you show me earlier? Because I wasn't sure it was real. I looked at the paper. What makes you think it isn't? Because my mother wrote it when she was very sick. She explained that Rachel had suffered from a condition that affected her memory near the end of her life. Some of her later letters were confused. But this particular note was dated several months before her condition became severe. So Natalie believed it was genuine. I turned to Ethan. Do you know anything about this? He shook his head. No. Then he noticed something written at the bottom of the page. A name. Samuel. My uncle. My father's younger brother. I felt a chill. I remembered him. Samuel had been around during my childhood, but he had disappeared shortly after my father died. I had always assumed he moved away. Rachel's letter made me question that. Where is Samuel now? Nobody knew. Natalie said she'd spent months trying to find him. She had finally located an old address. It was only an hour away. We decided to go there the next morning. Before leaving, I walked through the house alone. For the first time, I looked at it differently. This place wasn't just where Marianne and I had raised Ethan. It had been connected to Rachel, to Natalie, to my father, to secrets that had existed long before I understood them. And suddenly, I wondered what else Marianne had hidden. The next morning, we drove to Samuel's old address. The house was abandoned. The windows were covered. The garden was completely overgrown. There was a mailbox hanging crookedly from the fence. Natalie found an envelope inside. It had her name on it. She looked at me. How would he know I'd come? I didn't have an answer. Inside was a key. And a note. If you want the truth, go to the place where your mother first met Marianne. We knew immediately where that was. The old hospital. We drove there. The original building was no longer operating. It had been converted into administrative offices. After some searching, we found an employee who remembered the old records. He directed us to a storage room. There were boxes going back decades. We found Rachel's file, then Marianne's, then something unexpected. A file with my father's name. I opened it. Inside were bank statements, correspondence, and one photograph. My father was standing beside Samuel, but neither man was looking at the camera. They were standing outside the hospital. The date was the same day Natalie was born. I stared at it. Why were they both here? Ethan looked at the photograph. Then he noticed something. A woman was standing behind them. We zoomed in. It was Marianne. But she wasn't alone. She was holding a baby. And beside her stood Rachel. I felt my heart race. The photograph had been taken before Rachel officially gave birth. That meant something was wrong. Very wrong. Then Natalie found another document. It was a hospital admission form. Rachel had been admitted 2 days before Natalie's birth. But the baby's name wasn't Natalie. It said, female infant, temporary identity, baby R. I looked at Natalie. She was crying. My mother told me I was born on the 14th. The document was dated the 12th. I stared at it. That means you were born 2 days earlier. She shook her head. No. Ethan pointed to another page. The date was changed. Someone had crossed out the 12th and written the 14th. The handwriting looked familiar. I pulled out the photograph of my father's old signature. It wasn't his. Then we found another correction. This one was signed. The name was Samuel Carter. My uncle. I looked at Natalie. Your uncle was involved. She shook her head. Why would he change your birth date? I didn't know. But then we found a final note. It had been written by Marianne. Samuel didn't change the date to hide the adoption. He changed it to hide when the baby was transferred. I read the sentence again. Transferred where? The answer was in the next document. A temporary placement record. It showed that baby R had been moved to another hospital 2 days before Natalie was supposedly born. And the person who authorized the transfer wasn't Samuel. It was Rachel herself. Natalie stared at the paper. Why would my mother transfer me? I looked at her. Maybe she didn't. Then we noticed the signature. It wasn't Rachel's handwriting. Someone had forged it. And the person who witnessed the signature was the same hospital administrator Marianne had warned us about. At that moment, Ethan's phone rang. He answered. His face went pale. He handed the phone to me. It was an unknown number. A man's voice said, "You've been looking in the wrong place." I asked, "Who is this?" He replied, "My name is Samuel Carter." Then he said, "If you want to know what really happened to Rachel, come to the old house tonight." The call ended. I kept staring at the phone after the call ended. Samuel. My uncle. The man we'd been searching for. For more than 20 years, I had believed he was gone. Now he had called us himself. Ethan looked at me. Was that him? I nodded. What did he say? I told him. Natalie immediately said, "We're going." I looked at her. Are you sure? She nodded. I've spent my entire life trying to understand what happened to my mother. I'm not turning around now. The old house was about an hour away. It had belonged to my grandparents before Samuel inherited it. I hadn't been there since I was a teenager. We arrived just before sunset. The place looked abandoned from the road. But there was a light on upstairs. We knocked. No answer. We knocked again. Then the door opened. Samuel was standing there. He was older than I remembered. Much older. He had lost most of his hair and walked with a cane. But I recognized his eyes immediately. He looked at me. Harold. I didn't know whether to hug him or ask him why he'd disappeared. Instead, I said, "Why did you call us?" He looked at Natalie. Then his face changed. You grew up. Natalie stared at him. You knew me? I knew your mother. Did you know me? Samuel nodded. Yes. Natalie stepped forward. Then tell me what happened. Samuel looked at all three of us. Come inside. The living room was filled with old boxes. He had kept everything. Photographs. Letters. Bank records. Newspaper clippings. It looked like someone had spent decades collecting evidence. Samuel sat down. Then he said, Your father wasn't the person who started this. He looked at me. Your father made mistakes. Big ones. But he didn't arrange for Rachel's daughter to disappear. I asked, Then who did? Samuel looked toward the hallway. Your mother's father. I froze. My grandfather? He nodded. Your grandfather was involved with Rachel's husband. That was the one connection nobody had considered. My grandfather had owned a transportation company. Rachel's husband had worked with him. Samuel explained that money had been moving between several businesses. Rachel discovered it. She threatened to expose them. That's when everything began. I asked, Why was Natalie taken? Samuel answered, Because they believed Rachel had evidence. But she didn't. She did. He opened a box. Inside was a small notebook. Rachel had written down dates, account numbers, and names. She had documented everything. Samuel said Rachel hid the notebook before she died. But someone found out. That's why they wanted Natalie. They believed Rachel had told her daughter where it was. Natalie looked confused. I was 6. You didn't have to remember consciously, Samuel said. They thought you might have been told something. I asked where the notebook was. Samuel pointed toward the table. It's been missing for 23 years. Then why keep all this? Because I knew someone would eventually come looking. He looked at me. Marian came looking first. I sat down. What did she discover? Samuel sighed. She discovered your grandfather had been using your father's name. I felt stunned. So my father wasn't responsible? He knew what was happening. Samuel didn't soften it. He helped hide some of it. But he didn't take Natalie? No. Then why did he confess? Because he was ashamed. That made sense in a terrible way. My father had been involved, but not in the way we'd thought. He had helped hide the truth because he was afraid of his own father. Samuel continued. Your father thought he could protect you by keeping quiet. And Marianne? She thought she could protect everyone by keeping quiet. I looked at Natalie. And Rachel. Samuel's face became serious. Rachel wasn't supposed to die. Nobody spoke. He explained that Rachel's health had already been fragile. But the stress, fear, and constant pressure made everything worse. She died before she could expose the people involved. Before she died, she gave Marianne one instruction. Protect Natalie. And Marianne did. But there was still one mystery. I asked Samuel, Why did you disappear? He looked down. Because I was afraid. Of who? He didn't answer. Instead, he walked to an old cabinet. He opened a drawer. Inside was a cassette tape. He handed it to me. Your mother left this here. I stared at him. When? 3 months before she died. I couldn't understand. Why would she give you something instead of me? Because she knew someone was watching your house. My stomach tightened. Who? Samuel looked directly at me. I don't know. But you suspected someone. He nodded. Yes. Who? He said a name. And I felt the blood drain from my face. It was someone who had been at my house many times. Someone I trusted. Someone who had been asking questions about Natalie for months. Someone who had even encouraged Ethan to bring Natalie into the house. Samuel whispered, Your wife's attorney. I stared at him. That can't be. Samuel placed another document on the table. It's not just him. There was a second name. And that name was Ethan. I looked at my son. He didn't look surprised. He looked terrified. I looked at Ethan. He was pale. Why is your name on that document? He didn't answer. I asked again. Ethan, what did you do? He finally sat down. I didn't hurt anyone. Then tell me why Samuel put your name here. Ethan looked at Natalie. She seemed just as confused as I was. I knew about the lawyer, he finally said. What lawyer? Mom's attorney. I felt my anger rising. You knew he was involved? I knew he was asking questions. What kind of questions? Ethan rubbed his face. He wanted to know where Mom kept certain documents. And you told him? No. Then why didn't you tell me? Because Mom told me not to. I was getting tired of hearing that excuse. Everyone keeps saying Mom told them not to tell me. Ethan looked at me. Because she knew you would try to fix everything yourself. That hurt. But before I could respond, Samuel interrupted. Harold, that's not the biggest problem. He pointed toward the cassette. The lawyer wasn't looking for the documents. Then what was he looking for? The notebook. Rachel's notebook. The evidence that could expose everything. I asked Samuel where it was. He shook his head. I don't know. Then why did the lawyer think I had it? Because Marianne told him. I stared at him. Why would she do that? She didn't. Samuel looked at Natalie. Someone forged a letter. Natalie looked confused. Whose letter? Marianne's. He opened another folder. Inside was a photocopy of a letter supposedly written by my wife. It said the notebook was hidden somewhere inside our house. It also said Natalie would eventually inherit the property. But something about the letter looked wrong. I recognized Marianne's handwriting. The words looked like hers. But the signature didn't. I asked Samuel who had forged it. He said they suspected the lawyer. But they had no proof. Then he told us something else. The lawyer had visited my house twice while I was away. I immediately remembered. About 6 months ago, I had given my lawyer permission to inspect some old property documents. I had assumed it was routine. Now I wondered what he had really been doing. Natalie suddenly stood up. Wait. She opened her bag. I have something. She pulled out a small envelope. I found this inside my mother's old suitcase. She handed it to Samuel. He opened it. His face changed. What is it? He looked at me. The notebook. I froze. What? He pulled out a tiny photograph. On the back was a handwritten message. The notebook is not in the house. It is with the person Harold trusts most. I looked at Ethan. He looked at me. Then I realized something. There was only one person I had trusted enough to give access to everything. Marianne. After she died, I had given that access to someone else. Her attorney. The same attorney Samuel had just accused. I called him. No answer. I called again. Still nothing. Then my phone received a message. A photograph. It showed the notebook. And beneath it was a sentence. You should have left the past alone. I felt sick. Samuel stood up. We need to leave. Why? Because whoever sent that knows we're here. Then the lights in the house went out. Natalie grabbed Ethan's arm. For several seconds, nobody moved. Then we heard a car start outside. I ran to the window. A dark vehicle was pulling away. I couldn't see the driver. But I saw something hanging from the rearview mirror. A small blue ribbon. Marianne used to wear blue ribbons in her hair. I turned around. That's impossible. Samuel looked at me. What? My wife had one exactly like that. Then Natalie whispered. Maybe it isn't your wife's. She pointed toward the table. There was a second photograph. It showed a woman standing beside my wife. The same woman from the hospital photographs. Rachel. But Rachel was wearing the blue ribbon. I picked up the photograph. On the back was a date. The date was 3 years after Rachel was supposed to have died. I stared at it. Rachel might not have died when we thought she did. And if that was true, then everything we believed about Natalie's childhood was wrong. The photograph changed everything. I looked at the date again. There was no mistake. Rachel had supposedly died 26 years ago. But the photograph was taken 23 years ago. And she was standing beside Marianne. Alive. Healthy. Smiling. I looked at Natalie. Did your mother ever tell you she was alive after you were born? Natalie shook her head. No. Are you sure? My entire childhood was built around the fact that she died. Samuel slowly sat down. Then someone lied to everyone. I asked him who had identified Rachel's body. He didn't know. But he remembered something. Your father's company handled the hospital's transportation contracts. I stared at him. So, one of the vehicles was used to transport an unidentified patient around the same time Rachel supposedly died. I felt a chill. You're saying the body might not have been hers? Samuel nodded. We never proved it. Natalie looked devastated. My mother could have been alive? Maybe. She sat down. For the first time since I'd met her, she looked like a frightened child instead of an adult woman searching for answers. Ethan put his hand on her shoulder. She didn't pull away. Then Samuel said, "There is something else." He opened another box. Inside was an old newspaper clipping. It reported that a woman had been found unconscious near a highway. The woman had no identification. She was taken to a private clinic. The date was only weeks after Rachel's supposed death. I looked at Natalie. Could that be your mother? She shook her head. I don't know. Samuel pointed to the photograph attached to the article. The image was blurry. But there was something familiar about the woman. I couldn't prove it. Then Natalie whispered. I know that necklace. Everyone looked at her. My mother had that necklace. I looked closer. The woman in the photograph was wearing a small silver necklace. Exactly like the one in an old photograph Natalie had shown us earlier. We all went silent. Rachel may have survived. And if she had, Why had she never contacted Natalie? Why had Marianne allowed everyone to believe she was dead? We drove back to my house. I barely spoke during the entire trip. When we arrived, I went straight to Marianne's quiet room. I searched through every drawer, every photograph, every envelope. Then I noticed something I'd never noticed before. The bottom of her sewing machine cabinet had a loose wooden panel. I opened it. Inside was a small cassette recorder. And beside it was a note. "Harold, this is the recording I couldn't give you." My hand shook. I pressed play. Marianne's voice filled the room. "Harold, if you're hearing this, then Rachel has finally decided whether she wants to come home." I stopped breathing. She continued. "Yes, Rachel survived." Natalie covered her mouth. Marianne explained that Rachel had survived the incident that everyone believed killed her. But she had been severely injured. She was afraid to return because she believed the people who had threatened her would hurt Natalie. So she disappeared voluntarily. Marianne became the only person who knew where she was. Then came the part that broke my heart. Marianne said Rachel had asked to see Natalie. But she was afraid. She believed Natalie would be safer if she stayed away. I couldn't understand that. Why would a mother abandon her own daughter? Marianne's recording answered the question. Because she believed staying away was the only way to keep her alive. Natalie began crying. Then Marianne said something else. Rachel gave me the notebook. I froze. The evidence is real. But I never gave it to the authorities because the person behind everything was still watching. Then she said the name. Not my father. Not Samuel. Not the lawyer. Someone else. Someone I had known for decades. Someone who had been part of our family. Marianne whispered. Harold, the person who betrayed Rachel was your own mother. I couldn't move. My mother? She had been dead for 35 years. She had always been the gentle one in the family. The woman who baked cakes for every birthday. The woman who adored Ethan. The woman Marianne had trusted. But according to the recording, she had been the person who gave Rachel's location to the people looking for her. I stopped the recording. Nobody spoke. Then Natalie asked, "Why would your mother do that?" I didn't know. But Samuel looked terrified. He said, "Because she wasn't protecting your grandfather." I looked at him. Then who is she protecting? Samuel pointed toward the photograph of Rachel. Her own daughter. I stared at him. What? He looked at me. Harold, Rachel was your sister. I thought I had misunderstood Samuel. My sister. He nodded. Rachel was your father's daughter. I stared at him. My father had another daughter? Yes. I sat down. Everything we'd discovered suddenly felt even more complicated. Rachel wasn't some distant person connected to my family. She was my sister. That meant Natalie wasn't just connected to my wife. She was my niece. I looked at her. She was crying. Then why didn't anyone tell me? Samuel looked away. Because your father didn't want you to know. Why? Because Rachel was born before your parents married. I felt a strange emptiness. My father had kept an entire branch of the family hidden. But Samuel wasn't finished. Your mother knew. My voice became quiet. She knew Rachel was your father's daughter? Yes. Then why would she betray her? Samuel sighed. Because she believed Rachel was dangerous. I didn't understand. She was just a woman. Not to your mother. Samuel explained that Rachel had discovered what my father and grandfather were doing. She threatened to expose them. My mother became afraid that the family would be destroyed. So she gave Rachel's location to them. But Rachel escaped. She disappeared. And eventually, Marianne found her. That was when everything changed. Marianne helped Rachel disappear completely. She helped her build a new identity. She helped her stay away from Natalie. And she became Natalie's guardian. I looked at the old photograph of Marianne and Rachel. Suddenly, I understood why they had been so close. They weren't just friends. They were protecting the same child. But there was one thing that still didn't make sense. If Rachel survived, why did she never come for Natalie? Samuel answered quietly. Because she believed someone was still watching. Who? He shook his head. We never found out. I looked at the cassette recorder. Mom knew. Yes. Then why didn't she tell me? Because she was afraid you'd go after them. I laughed bitterly. So everyone decided what I could handle. Nobody answered. Then Natalie suddenly spoke. What if my mother is still alive? Samuel looked at her. That's what we need to find out. We spent the next few hours going through Marianne's records. Eventually, we found a name. Evelyn Carter. It was listed as a medical contact. The address was in another state. Natalie searched the name online. Nothing. Then she found an old photograph. A woman standing outside a small house. Older. But the eyes were unmistakable. Rachel. Natalie began crying. That's her. I stared at the photograph. My sister was alive. At least, we thought she was. We called the number associated with the address. Someone answered. A woman's voice. Hello. Natalie couldn't speak. I took the phone. Are you Evelyn Carter? Silence. Then the woman said, Who is this? I replied, My name is Harold. Another silence. Then her voice changed. Harold? I felt my heart stop. She knew my name. I asked, Are you Rachel? She didn't answer. Instead, she said, Where is Natalie? Natalie grabbed the phone from me. Mom? The woman on the other end started crying. There was no doubt anymore. It was Rachel, Natalie's mother, alive. After 26 years. Rachel said she had been waiting for the right moment to return. But then she asked a question that terrified me. Is Marion still alive? Natalie began crying harder. No. Rachel went silent. Then she whispered. Then I'm too late. I asked what she meant. Rachel said. Marion was the only person who knew the entire truth. What truth? She hesitated. Then said. The person who caused all of this isn't dead. My heart dropped. Who? Rachel said a name. I immediately recognized it. It was the same name written on the forged documents. The lawyer. He wasn't just involved. He had been part of the scheme from the beginning. And then Rachel said something even worse. He knows where you live. I looked around my house. The curtains were open. The lights were on. For the first time, I felt like someone might be watching us. Rachel continued. Harold, don't trust anyone around that house. I asked why. She answered. Because the person who betrayed me has been trying to get that property for decades. Then the call suddenly disconnected. I immediately called back. No answer. We tried again. Nothing. Natalie looked at me. What do we do? Before I could answer, someone knocked on the front door. 3 slow knocks. Everyone froze. Then another knock. Ethan whispered. Dad, don't open it. I looked through the window. There was a man standing outside. He was holding a folder. And when he looked up at the house, I recognized him. It was Marianne's attorney. Nobody moved. The attorney stood outside the front door, holding a thick folder against his chest. His name was Victor Hale. I'd known him for almost 15 years. He had handled Marianne's will. He had helped me settle her estate. He had even attended her funeral. And now he was standing outside my house after Rachel had warned us not to trust anyone around it. I whispered. How did he know we're here? Ethan didn't answer. Victor knocked again. Then he called my name. Harold, I know you're inside. I looked at Natalie. She was pale. Victor's voice remained calm. I need to speak with you. Ethan whispered. Don't open the door. I agreed. Victor waited. Then he said, I know you found the recordings. My stomach dropped. He knew. He continued. And I know you've spoken to Rachel. Natalie stepped backward. How? Victor heard her through the door. I've been trying to protect this family for years. I almost laughed. By hiding things from us? He didn't respond. Instead, he placed the folder on the porch. I'm leaving this here. Then he walked back toward his car. I waited until he was gone. Then I opened the door and grabbed the folder. Inside were copies of legal documents, property records, old bank statements, and one photograph. It showed Victor standing beside my grandfather. The date was 28 years old. I looked at Ethan. He's been involved since before you were born. But there was something even stranger. One of the documents contained my mother's signature. It transferred control of the property to a trust. The beneficiary wasn't Natalie. It was Ethan. I stared at the paper. What? Ethan looked shocked. I didn't know. The trust had been created shortly after Ethan was born. According to the document, he would receive control of the property when he turned 35. He was 36 now. That meant the transfer should already have happened. But it hadn't. I looked at the date. The document had been amended several times. The most recent amendment was made 6 months ago. By Victor. And it removed Ethan. The new beneficiary was a company. A company I had never heard of. I searched the company name. It belonged to a property investment group. Victor had been trying to transfer ownership of the house. That explained everything. But why Natalie? Why had he been asking questions about her? Then Ethan remembered something. Wait. He pulled out his phone. 6 months ago, Victor asked me to sign something. I looked at him. What? He said it was an authorization for estate paperwork. Did you sign it? Ethan looked embarrassed. Yes. I felt my anger rise. Did you read it? No. Then you may have signed away your rights. He shook his head. I didn't know. Natalie looked at the documents. Maybe that's why he wanted me to come back. I realized what was happening. Victor couldn't legally transfer the property without resolving the old trust. But if Natalie appeared and claimed an interest in the property, it would create confusion. He could use that confusion to delay everything. Or possibly force a sale. I looked at the old agreement. Then I noticed something. There was a handwritten note on the final page. It wasn't from Victor. It was from Marianne. The house must never be sold without Harold's consent. I felt tears in my eyes. Even after all these years, Marianne was still trying to protect me. Then another thought hit me. Why did Victor leave the folder? Samuel looked at me. Because he wants you to see something. I opened the final document. It was a legal notice. It stated that Victor intended to challenge the validity of Marianne's trust. And the hearing was scheduled for the following week. If he won, the house could be sold. But there was a handwritten message at the bottom. Bring Natalie. I looked at her. Why? She shook her head. I don't know. Then my phone rang. It was Rachel. I answered immediately. Her voice was barely above a whisper. Harold, listen carefully. What happened? I found the notebook. My heart stopped. Where? With me. Then why didn't you tell us? Because Victor isn't working alone. I looked at Ethan. Who else is involved? Rachel was silent for several seconds. Then she said, someone you trust. I felt sick. Who? Rachel said the name. It wasn't Ethan. It wasn't Samuel. It wasn't Victor. It was someone who had been standing beside me throughout this entire investigation. Someone who had been helping us find the truth. Someone I had never suspected. Rachel whispered, it's Natalie. The call ended. I slowly turned toward my son's future wife. She was standing in the middle of my living room. And for the first time, I wondered whether every answer she'd given us had been carefully planned. I didn't say anything. Neither did Natalie. Ethan looked from me to her. Dad? I raised my hand. Give me a minute. I needed to think. Rachel had just accused Natalie of being involved. But everything Natalie had told us had led us closer to the truth. She had shown us the photographs. She had brought the letters. She had helped us find the hospital records. Why would she do all that if she was working against us? Unless that was exactly what she wanted us to believe. I looked at her. Did you know Victor before you met Ethan? She shook her head. No. Did you know about the property? Yes. Did you know about the trust? Yes. Did you know Rachel was alive? She hesitated, then nodded. My stomach dropped. Since when? 6 months. 6 months. She looked at Ethan. That's when I found out. I turned toward him. You knew. He shook his head. I knew she was searching for her mother. I didn't know Rachel was alive. I looked back at Natalie. Why didn't you tell me? Because my mother asked me not to. I was beginning to hate that sentence. Everyone had a reason for keeping secrets. But Natalie wasn't finished. She pulled a letter from her bag. This is from my mother. I opened it. Rachel wrote that she had discovered Victor was still trying to gain control of the property. She believed the house contained evidence. But she didn't trust the authorities. She trusted Natalie. And she wanted Natalie to find the evidence before Victor did. I looked at the final paragraph. Do not trust anyone who tells you they can solve this quickly. That sounded exactly like Rachel. But then I noticed something. The letter was dated 3 months ago. Rachel had told us she'd found the notebook recently. Why hadn't she mentioned it before? I asked Natalie. Where's the notebook now? She didn't answer. Where? She finally said. I don't have it. Then who does? She looked at me. Victor. My heart sank. She explained that she had found the notebook weeks earlier. But Victor had discovered her searching. He took it. She had been trying to recover it ever since. I didn't know whether to believe her. Then Ethan spoke. I believe her. I looked at him. Why? Because she could have taken the house already if she wanted it. He had a point. Natalie had no reason to keep helping us if her goal was simply the property. Then the doorbell rang. Everyone froze. This time, it was Samuel. He walked inside carrying a small suitcase. He looked at Natalie, then at me. I found Rachel. Natalie stood up. What? She's coming here. I stared at him. Why? Because she says it's time. For what? Samuel looked toward the quiet room. To tell you what really happened. An hour later, Rachel arrived. She looked older than the photograph. But there was no doubt. She and Natalie embraced. Neither spoke. They just held each other. I watched them from a distance. After 26 years, a mother had finally been reunited with her daughter. Then Rachel turned toward me. I'm sorry. I shook my head. You don't owe me an apology. She looked at the house. Marian wanted you to know everything. Then tell me. Rachel sat down. She explained that my mother had betrayed her, but not because she wanted money. She was being threatened. Someone had threatened to expose a secret about our family. A secret involving my birth. I didn't understand. Rachel looked at me. Harold, your father wasn't your biological father. I felt like the floor disappeared. What? Rachel continued. My mother was the one who knew the truth. I stared at her. What are you saying? She took a deep breath. Your biological father was my father. I couldn't speak. Rachel was my half-sister. And my father had not been my biological father. The family tree I'd believed in my entire life was completely wrong. Rachel said my mother had discovered the truth years earlier. She had stayed with my father anyway. But when Rachel threatened to reveal the family's financial secrets, my mother panicked. She gave Rachel's location away. Marianne discovered the truth years later. That's why she became involved. That's why she protected Natalie. That's why she never told me. I felt betrayed by people who were no longer alive. Then Rachel reached into her bag. She pulled out a small notebook. The missing notebook. She placed it on the table. Victor never had it. I stared at her. Then why did he think he did? Rachel looked at Natalie. Because we wanted him to think that. I looked between them. You set him up? Rachel nodded. We needed him to reveal himself. Then Natalie quietly said, That's why I came into your life. My heart sank. So Ethan. She shook her head immediately. No, I didn't marry Ethan for the house. Then what was the plan? Rachel answered. To make Victor believe Natalie had access to the property. I looked at my son's wife. She had lied to us. But perhaps she had lied to protect us. Then Rachel opened the notebook. Inside were names, dates, payments, and one final page. It contained Victor's name. But beneath it was another name. Someone who had been funding him. Someone we all knew. Rachel looked at me. Harold, there's one last person you need to know about. She turned the page. And I recognized the name immediately. Ethan's employer. The man who had been helping my son financially for the past year. The man who had encouraged Ethan to move into my house. The man who had introduced him to Victor. I stared at the name in the notebook. I knew that man. Everyone in our town knew him. Martin Cole had been Ethan's employer for almost 4 years. He had given Ethan his first major promotion. He had helped him buy his car. And according to Ethan, he had always treated him like family. Now his name was written in Rachel's notebook. I looked at my son. Ethan, what exactly has Martin done for you? Ethan looked confused. I told you. He helped me with work. Did he ever give you money? Sometimes. How much? Ethan hesitated. About $40,000. I stared at him. For what? He said it was an advance. Rachel shook her head. It wasn't. Ethan looked at her. How do you know? Because Martin's name appears beside the payments in my mother's notebook. I opened the notebook. There were several payments made over the last 2 years. Small amounts at first, then larger ones. The dates matched the period when Ethan started asking about the house. I looked at him. Did Martin ever ask you about this property? Ethan went silent. That was answer enough. How many times? Several. Why? He said he was interested in investing. Did he ever ask you to convince me to sell? Ethan looked down. Once. I felt betrayed. Why didn't you tell me? I didn't think it mattered. Rachel interrupted. It mattered. She pointed to another entry. Martin had been paying Victor. And Victor had been paying someone else. The final recipient was a company connected to the hospital administrator from 26 years ago. The entire scheme had survived for decades. Different names. Different companies. Different people. But the same goal. Control the property. I asked Rachel why the house was so important. She finally explained. The land wasn't ordinary. Before my grandparents bought it, there had been an old family business on the property. A storage facility. Rachel's father had used it to hide financial records. Some of those records were never recovered. Everyone assumed they were destroyed. They weren't. Marianne had found them. And she hid them inside the house. I felt a chill. So that's what Victor wants. Rachel nodded. The records prove everything. I looked toward the quiet room. The house has been hiding evidence all these years. Yes. Then Ethan said, Wait. He pulled out his phone. There was one thing Martin asked me to do. What? Take a photograph of the basement. I stared at him. When? 2 months ago. Why? He said he wanted to estimate renovation costs. Rachel looked alarmed. Did you send it? Yes. She closed her eyes. Then he knows where the records are. We all went silent. I suddenly remembered the loose floorboard. The hidden cabinet. The old storage room. The house had been searched before. Someone had been looking for something, and now they knew exactly where to look. I told everyone to stay upstairs. I went down to the basement. The old shelves were covered in dust. I searched every corner. Nothing. Then I noticed the wall behind the furnace. One brick looked slightly different. I removed it. Behind it was a metal box. I pulled it out. Inside were dozens of documents. Bank records, contracts, photographs, letters, and one small envelope. It had my name on it. I opened it. Marian had written, "Harold, if you found this, then they finally came looking." I kept reading. She explained that she had discovered the truth about my family. She knew the house contained evidence, but she didn't want me involved. She believed the people responsible would eventually come for it. Then she wrote something that broke me. "I am sorry I made you live with questions you never knew to ask." I sat on the basement floor. For years, I'd thought Marian had hidden things because she didn't trust me. Now I understood. She had been trying to give me a normal life, even if it meant carrying the burden herself. I found one final document. It was a signed agreement between Victor and Martin. They planned to purchase the property through a shell company, but the agreement had a condition. Ethan had to convince Harold to leave the house voluntarily. I looked at the page. Then everything clicked. Ethan's request to move in, Natalie's return, Victor's legal documents, Martin's financial support. It had all been connected. I walked upstairs. Ethan was waiting. I placed the agreement in front of him. His face went white. "Dad, did you know?" He shook his head. "Not about this." "Then what did you know?" He finally broke down. "Martin told me if I could convince you to sell, he'd make me a partner." I stared at my son. "How much?" "Enough to change my life." I asked, "Did you agree?" He started crying. I almost did. The room went silent. Natalie looked at him. "Almost?" Ethan nodded. "But Mom's letter changed my mind." "What letter?" He pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket. It was from Marianne. She had written it to him before she died. The final sentence said, "If you ever have to choose between money and your father, choose your father." Ethan looked at me. "I chose you." I didn't know what to say. Then we heard a car outside. Rachel looked through the window. "It's Martin." I looked at Ethan. "Did you tell him where the documents were?" "No." Then the front door opened. Martin walked inside. He wasn't alone. Victor was with him. And Victor was holding a copy of the property agreement. He smiled. "You finally found the records." I realized the truth. They hadn't come to negotiate. They had come because they knew we had the evidence. And this time, they weren't leaving without it. Martin stood in the doorway with Victor beside him. For the first time, I wasn't afraid. I had spent weeks thinking everyone around me was hiding something. Now I finally understood why. They had all been protecting pieces of the same truth. I held up the documents. "You came for these?" Victor smiled. "You don't understand what you're holding." "I understand enough." Martin stepped forward. "Ethan, you don't want to do this." My son looked at him. "I already did." Martin frowned. "I don't understand." Ethan pulled out his phone. "I recorded everything you just said." Martin's expression changed. I realized Ethan had been recording from the moment they entered. Victor immediately turned toward the door. But Samuel was already standing there. He had called the police before we came upstairs. A few minutes later, officers arrived. Martin and Victor were taken outside for questioning. The documents were handed over as evidence. For the first time in decades, the truth was no longer hidden inside my house. It was finally in the hands of people who could investigate it properly. But there was still one person I needed to talk to. Rachel. She stood in the kitchen with Natalie. I looked at her. "Why didn't you come back sooner?" Rachel looked at her daughter. "Because I was afraid. Of Victor. Of everyone." She explained that after escaping years ago, she had built a quiet life under another name. Marian was the only person she stayed in contact with. When Marian became ill, Rachel wanted to return. But Marian begged her to wait. She knew that if Rachel came back too soon, the people looking for the old records would find her. So Rachel stayed away. Until Natalie turned 29. That was when Marian had planned everything. She knew Natalie would eventually return to the house. She knew the old property documents would surface. And she knew Victor would make a move. Marian had prepared for all of it, even after she was gone. I looked around the house. For years, I'd thought it belonged to me because I had paid the bills, repaired the roof, raised my son there, and spent my entire marriage inside those walls. But I finally understood something. A house isn't just bricks and paperwork. Sometimes it becomes a container for the lives people lived before you. This house had carried secrets for decades. And now those secrets were finally over. A few months later, the investigation ended. Victor and Martin faced legal consequences for the financial scheme. The old records helped uncover what had happened to Rachel and several other families. The property itself remained legally protected. Natalie could have taken it. She could have sold it. She could have asked me to leave. Instead, she came to me one morning with a folder. "I've made my decision." I opened it. She had transferred her future interest in the house into a family trust. My name was listed as the person allowed to live there for the rest of my life. I looked at her. "Why?" She smiled. "Because this was never really about the house." Then she looked at Ethan. "It was about finding my mother." Rachel was sitting in the garden. For the first time, mother and daughter were together without having to hide from anyone. Ethan and I also had a long conversation. I told him I was hurt that he had kept things from me. He admitted that he had been tempted by Martin's offer. He didn't try to make excuses. He simply said, "I was stupid." I told him, "Being tempted doesn't make you a bad son. Choosing to deceive someone does." He nodded. "And I'm sorry." I forgave him. Not immediately, but eventually. Because forgiveness doesn't mean pretending nothing happened. It means deciding that what happened won't control the rest of your life. As for Natalie, she never moved into the house permanently. She and Ethan rented a place nearby. Rachel eventually moved closer too. And every Sunday, the three of them came for dinner. Sometimes Rachel and I would sit on the porch and talk about Marianne. We would remember the woman who had carried a secret for decades because she believed protecting other people was more important than protecting herself. One evening, Rachel handed me an old photograph. It showed Marianne, Rachel, and me when we were young. I stared at it for a long time. Then Rachel said, "She always said you'd eventually understand." I smiled sadly. She was right. I looked at the house. For months, I'd been asking myself the wrong question. Was I wrong for refusing to let my son and his wife move into the house? The real question was whether I had the right to protect my home while everyone around me was asking me to trust them. And honestly, I still don't know if I handled every moment perfectly. I know I was angry. I know I accused people before I knew the whole truth. But I also know that by the end, my son was still beside me. Natalie had found her mother. Rachel finally had a chance to tell her story, and Marianne's final wishes had been honored. The house stayed in the family. But more importantly, the family finally stopped living in secrets. And that's what Marianne wanted all along. What would you have done if you were in my place?